It was while studying for my A Levels that I decided to become a historian. I absolutely fell in love with Tudor history in particular, and I owe a great deal to my history teacher, Mrs. Jones. Well, I'm talking about one of my favourite historical subjects. The man, I think we can still call him the man of the moment. And before I start, could I just ask for a show of hands as to how many of you have either read or watched Wolf Hall? Yeah, quite a few. Don't worry if you haven't. But this really, this Booker Prize-winning trilogy by Hilary Mantel transformed Thomas Cromwell from a kind of villainous figure, really, in history, or even worse, just a faceless bureaucrat, and into this hero. Well, I remember when her first book in the trilogy came out, back, I think, in 2009, and I was captivated by her portrayal, but I thought, doesn't sound very much like the Cromwell I learned about at school when doing my A-levels, and he was far more of a cutthroat politician than a sympathetic hero. So it set me off on my quest to write my non-fiction biography, because I wanted to find out how much of Hilary Mantel's fictional portrayal was based on historical fact. And suffice to say, I became so obsessed with Thomas Cromwell. The more I found out about him, the more I admired this self-made man, that I decided I would get married in the chapel where he's buried at the Tower of London. That was back in 2014. I then named my new dog Cromwell and gave a sign above his little kennel, which is Wolf Hall. And I have a sort of portrait of Cromwell on my walls. So, yeah, basically I'm a Cromwell obsessive, and hopefully you will find out why as my talk continues. And I want to tell you the real story behind Henry VIII's famous and faithful chief minister and the impact that he had in England, in particularly on England's religious life. Well, Cromwell's own life started in about the year 1485. We don't know exactly because he was born a nobody. He was just the son of a humble blacksmith, and births, deaths and marriages weren't generally recorded at the time of his birth, but we think it was about 1485. I personally hope it was that year because it was rather a good one for the Tudors. It's when the Tudor dynasty began with Henry VII, who defeated Richard III, as I'm sure you will all know, at the Battle of Bosworth that August. Well, Cromwell was born in Putney, west of London. Now, if you're born in Putney today and go on to have a successful career, nobody would question it because Putney is a very affluent suburb. But it wasn't in the late 15th century when Cromwell was born. In fact, you wouldn't want to find yourself in Putney after dark or even before dark, because it was full of cutthroats and criminals. And one of the worst criminals of all in 15th century Putney was Cromwell's own father. Walter Cromwell was forever in trouble with the law. Now, I mentioned that he was a blacksmith. He was also a brewer. He owned a pub on Brewhouse Lane. The Brewhouse Lane, you can still go there. The pub is long since gone. And he was a property owner and developer as well. And I was astonished when researching my biography of Walter Cromwell's son to find that Walter's name appeared in the criminal records no fewer than 43 times. He was hauled before the courts, and his crimes ranged from drunken brawls to the worst crime of all, because it carried the heaviest penalty, and that was watering down the beer that he sold, and he got into more trouble than for anything else. Well, we don't know much about Thomas Cromwell's early childhood, what his relationship was like with his father, or indeed with his mother, but certainly it seems to have been quite difficult because Thomas Cromwell could not wait to escape the family home. When he was possibly as young as 12, he didn't just leave Putney, he left England altogether, and he decided to become a mercenary. This was one of the few career opportunities open to a young man with no trade, very little education and no contacts. So he was really a paid soldier, and he joined the French army and fought in the Franco-Italian wars. But the military life didn't really suit Thomas Cromwell. He witnessed such horror in one particular battle close to Naples in southern Italy that he decided enough was enough, and he left the French army. He travelled north to Florence to try to find his fortune. Well, Florence at that time was in the high Renaissance. It was the epicenter of this cultural revolution in all areas of art and literature, and increasingly in religion too. And Thomas Cromwell was now at the heart of that himself. But he wasn't able to exactly enjoy being in Renaissance Florence, because having left the French army, he had no means of supporting himself. And we know he was there because of a novelist who actually wrote a character based on Cromwell, whom he found begging on the streets of Florence. He saw him there, and he wasn't the only one to see Cromwell begging. There was a very wealthy Florentine merchant called Francesco Frescobaldi, and he happened to notice this young man begging on the streets, and he went to talk to him, and he asked him why he was begging, why he had fallen on hard times. And when Cromwell started to reply in English, because he couldn't yet speak Italian, Frescobaldi was so delighted because he loved English people, and he offered Cromwell an apprenticeship. He was a wealthy merchant, he traded in wine, and he offered to take Cromwell back to his mansion in Florence, where he'd be one of his apprentices. Well, it's all about what you do with these pieces of good fortune in life, and Cromwell certainly justified the faith that Frescobaldi placed in him, and he became one of the most successful members of the Frescobaldi household. And whilst there, he not only became quite accomplished in trade, but he also met some of the leading lights of the Italian Renaissance, including Michelangelo himself. After a few years working for Frescobaldi, Cromwell decided it was time for a new adventure. He'd now got lots of experience and contacts in trade. So he went to the trading capital of Europe, the Netherlands, and he is found in Antwerp and Bruges, these great sort of crossroads of commercial Europe. And by the time he finally returns to England in 1513, so by now he's probably in his late 20s, and he's quite a wealthy young man. He's doing very well, and he has this impressive network of trading contacts across Europe. So what does any young man do when he's trying to establish himself back in his home city? He takes a wife, the wealthy widow Elizabeth Williams. There are few details of Cromwell's marriage surviving, but it seems to have been a harmonious one. He always referred to her as his dearly beloved wife, or right trusty and well beloved. He sent her regular gifts when he was at court. They had 3 children that we know about, 2 daughters, Anne and Grace, and a son, Gregory. Again, we don't have portraits of them. And I really love the fact that Thomas Cromwell spent as much time and money on the education of his daughters as on his son. And that was highly unusual for the time. Actually, the other person who did that was Thomas More, who would end up a mortal enemy of Thomas Cromwell. And actually, his daughters, Anne and Grace, justified the expense. I'm afraid Gregory was not a natural scholar, but he was the son and heir of Thomas Cromwell. The Cromwells made their home at Austin Friars. The house no longer exists, and on the site today, in the heart of the City of London, not far from the Tower, is Draper's Hall. Is one of the livery companies in the City of London. But it was, at the time, quite a nice, if fairly modest house that Cromwell chose to establish his family in. So he's a man on the make. He is accomplished in trade. He also becomes a bit like his father, a more successful version of his father, in that he's a jack of all trades. He is also a property developer, and he's gaining a reputation as a lawyer. And I can't state how impressive this is, because Cromwell is a self-taught lawyer. There's no record of any kind of legal training in his youth, but he really becomes known for his skill in the legal profession. It's a really interesting time now. So he comes back to England in 1513. And over the next few years, there are these new ideas that start to spring up in Europe and infiltrate England. And they're all thanks to Martin Luther, who in 1517, he pins his 95 Theses, his attack on the Roman Catholic Church, on a church door, and it really just lights a fuse. He's criticising the abuses of the Catholic Church. He's calling for a sizable reformation in Europe's religious life. Well, Cromwell may well have heard of Luther during his travels, and we know that he had access to some new radical religious texts that were starting to be circulated in Europe at the time. But at least initially, Cromwell despised Luther. Luther was seen as a complete radical, quite a dangerous man here in England, and Cromwell wanted nothing to do with him, but in fact, he would come to embrace many of Luther's ideas. For the time being, though, Cromwell was firmly conservative in religion, and he had a very conservative patron in the form of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Well, I'm delighted to say that so much of my talk this morning has history where it happened moments, because there's an awful lot of Cromwell's story linked to Hampton Court. And Hampton Court's original builder was Wolsey. Now, these two men had an awful lot in common. They were both of lowly birth. And that really set them apart in the court of Henry VIII, which tended to be filled with nobles, with dukes, with earls who just, father succeeded son. And so it's kind of a closed world. And yet here we have Cromwell, the blacksmith's son, and Wolsey, the son of a butcher. They're both self-made men who work their way to prominence in the royal court through the sheer force of their personalities and their abilities. Well, Wolsey has heard about this gifted young lawyer called Cromwell, and he decides to test him out. He employs him on what will become quite a significant piece of legal business. Because Wolsey, as part of being chief minister to Henry VIII and the original builder of Hampton Court, he has ambitions in both the political and religious sphere, and he wants to leave his mark on the world, including a new building project initially called Cardinal's College at Oxford University. And in order to finance his building project, Wolsey tasks Thomas Cromwell with the conveyance of a number of small religious houses. In other words, he wants these religious houses dissolved and the proceeds to fund his new college at Oxford. So you might say this is a really early example, very early 1520s, of the dissolution of the monasteries, which will really gather ground in the 1530s. And I just wonder if Cromwell's involvement in this just planted a seed for his later activity. Well, he certainly proved himself in this task for Wolsey, and he rapidly rose through the ranks of Wolsey's servants, and there were a lot of them. Here at Hampton Court, Wolsey's household numbered between 400 and 500 servants. They included secretaries, advisors, officials, messengers, as well as the kind of day-to-day servants you would expect in a palace like this. But Cromwell really very quickly became Thomas Wolsey's right-hand man. So as the 1520s progress, everything is going brilliantly for Thomas Cromwell. He has all of these thriving private businesses of his own, and now he has this very wealthy and very influential patron who is the right-hand man of King Henry VIII. But then, it's always when you think nothing can possibly go wrong that everything does. And the end of the 1520s sees an unravelling for Thomas Cromwell, both in his personal life and in his professional one.